Hello and welcome back to GCSE History Lessons. In this lesson, we will look at the Berlin Crisis of 1961, which involved building of the Berlin Wall and Checkpoint Charlie standoff. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the events and impact of the Berlin Crisis of 1961. You will remember from last lesson that Berlin had become a Cold War sticking point in the 1950s. The city was still administered by the USSR, USA, Britain and France during the 1950s, despite being 100 miles within the German Democratic Republic. During this decade, you will remember that the exodus of refugees from east to west, especially via Berlin, and the nuclear military strategy of NATO greatly heightened tensions between the USSR and USA. Khrushchev, faced with an ideological defeat if he did not stop the flow of refugees, proposed an ultimatum to the West to create the demilitarized Free City of Berlin. Otherwise, he would hand over the city's communications to the GDR government. We saw last lesson that after various summits, the threat of GDR control of Berlin was dropped, but the question of how to resolve tensions in Berlin were not resolved. The USSR and USA agreed to meet in Paris in 1960 to discuss the matter further. But on May 1, 1960, just 13 days before the Paris summit, the USSR shot down an American U-2 spy plane over Soviet airspace. To make matters worse, US President Eisenhower initially said the plane was to monitor the weather, but the Soviets uncovered the film which proved the plane was spying on them. The USA had lost all credibility, and also the moral high ground going into the Paris summit. No agreement was reached, and tensions between the USA and USSR reached an all-time high. On November 8, 1960, US President Eisenhower was replaced by John F. Kennedy. When young Kennedy met Khrushchev for the first time in Vienna in June 1961, Khrushchev humiliated Kennedy with tough diplomacy, demanding he remove US troops from West Berlin and sign a peace treaty handing Berlin over to the GDR. Kennedy, eager to prove his strength, refused and increased US military spending on July 25, 1961. Alongside these tensions were the tensions over Berlin and the humiliating refugee crisis. Walter Ulbricht, the GDR leader, was determined not to let the refugee crisis become a humiliation. He therefore announced in June 1961 that a wall would not be built between East and West Germany. But this caused even more to flee westward. Over 35,000 East Germans, over half under the age of 25, fled to the west that July. In the first 12 days of August, 22,000 emigrated. Khrushchev felt the pressure of this refugee crisis. The flood of people out of East Germany and into the West showed that people preferred the US capitalist system. It was becoming an ideological humiliation for the USSR. US President Kennedy even said, "Khrushchev is losing East Germany. He cannot let that happen. If East Germany goes, so will Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe." In the early hours of August 13, 1961, GDR troops erected barricades and barbed wire along the boundary that divided Berlin. The barbed wire was then replaced with a 12-foot-high concrete wall flanked by nearly 300 watchtowers and a maze of ancillary fences. The move was considered brutal in the West, showing the USSR's ideological inferiority as it required physical barriers to keep its own people within its borders. For Khrushchev, it was the best way for the USSR to shut down the humiliating Berlin refugee problem without sparking retaliation from the West. There was a general agreement amongst NATO members that a wall was at least better than a war. Kennedy visited Berlin on June 26, 1963, the anniversary of the Berlin airlift, to make an example of the difference between East and West. He said, "Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. What is the great issue between the free world and the communist world? Let them come to Berlin." But the wall didn't stop conflict from almost erupting later that year in October 1961. To stop the West challenging the USSR's sphere of influence, or the building of the Berlin Wall itself, Soviet tanks rolled up to face American tanks at Checkpoint Charlie on October 27th. The two forces faced off for 18 hours before diplomats could persuade each side to slowly back away. So, to summarise what we've learned today, The USSR shot down an American U-2 spy plane before the Paris summit, derailing talks about the demilitarization of Berlin. Eisenhower was replaced by Kennedy as President of the USA, who was humiliated at the Vienna summit and seen to be weak compared to Khrushchev. The flood of refugees from East to West Germany via Berlin reached a peak in August 1961, and the GDR government responded by erecting the Berlin Wall, restricting all movement from east to west. US and USSR troops faced off at Checkpoint Charlie in case the move caused fighting. The forces faced off for 18 hours before they backed away. The Berlin Wall was an ideological defeat for the USSR and GDR, but the West did not wish to touch the issue for fear of sparking nuclear war. Next lesson, we'll look at the lead up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, including the events of the Cuban Revolution and the reaction of the US. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.